Hey guys, thanks so much for having me today. Why don't we go ahead and just have everyone take a seat? Can we get a round of applause for the band? They were killing it. Yeah. Yeah, it's great to be back. Thank you, Brian, for inviting me back. I always love Georgia for the lower prices and the great weather. Am I right? Okay, that joke didn't land. I was at my dad's office earlier today and there was a fire drill. As we were exiting the building, I heard people say it was really chilly. I was in a t-shirt and I was like, wow, this weather is really great, honestly, compared to Boston. And then later on, I was at a coffee shop with my dad and my dad was like, wow, the coffee is $4.50. It's really expensive now. And I was like, wait, coffee is like $7.50 in Boston. That's crazy. Like, this is so cheap. And just as I was thinking about that, I was realizing so many things in life are a matter of perspective. Because for people who live here in Georgia, weather is really cold and then the prices are sometimes really high. But for someone who lives in the north, it's kind of the opposite. You guys should still visit Boston though. It's really, really great. And that's how I think about the issue of social isolation and loneliness sometimes. For so many people, loneliness is like one-dimensional. And as I was thinking about what I wanted to say to y'all tonight, I wanted to share my experience in high school and now at Harvard, how I've seen loneliness evolve and seen the greater perspectives on it. So today there are 3 different myths that I want to debunk on what social isolation looks like. First of which is that social isolation is only for people who don't have friends. Second, social isolation is purely a psychological thing. And third, social isolation is permanence. Starting with the first one. I went to Whisper as a sophomore in high school. And like Jake, I had no idea what was really going on. What do you mean this is a movement, not a club? What do you mean that we're just gonna go around and talk with one another? I heard there was Chick-fil-A, so I pulled up. And so it didn't make sense with me back then, but then as a senior, I came back for 2 reasons. 1, I saw the problem, and 2, I felt it myself. I was involved with a lot of different organizations on the state level in high school, and we did a lot of great work at a national level. We raised money for kids with disabilities. And I felt really cool and righteous doing a lot of great stuff for my community. But then I would come back to school and see students sitting by themselves at lunch. I would walk into my classes and see students with their hoodies up trying to pretend that they're not there. And I felt this internal sense of confliction that here I was trying to do stuff on a national level, but within my own local school community, there was so much hurt. And that didn't sit right with me. I also felt the problem. After my sophomore year, taking AP exams, do you also have APs? Is that? Okay, cool. After my AP exam, I went back to my car. It had been a great end to a great year, but inside, I felt so empty for some reason. I just kept asking myself this question. If my car broke down at night and I couldn't call my mom or my dad, who would I call? It just killed me that I didn't have a friend's name that immediately popped up, which was weird because I thought I had a lot of friends. I thought I knew a lot of people, but why couldn't I think of a person? And while I was crying, I actually had to stop crying because one of my teachers walked by, so that's a different story. And when I think of that conundrum of how can you still feel lonely but have a lot of friends, I think of the Truman Show. The movie is about Jim Carrey who lives in a town, he has a great life, but then as a viewer, we see that he's actually the main character of a TV show built around him. And everybody knows he's the main star in the TV show, and that all his friends are actually actors. I'm gonna spoil the movie. Eventually he finds out he's like being filmed all the time, and then he escapes. Well, what's interesting about the movie is that even though his day is fine and he has wonderful conversations and normal conversations with people, something doesn't feel right. He feels empty inside. None of those interactions feel genuine. He eventually figures out the reason why is because he's in a ploy of a TV show. His story is oftentimes a lot of our realities, which is incredibly, incredibly sad. My point here is that it's not about the quantity of relationships you have, but the quality of relationships. And that social isolation is a universal factor. It does not discriminate. People who have a lot of friends are oftentimes the most lonely. Number two, social isolation is purely a psychological thing. It's something in your mind and you can get over it if you're mentally tough. There's a study by Harvard that tracked 782 men and women for 75 years. It's the longest running study of human health and happiness. They find that the people who live longer tend to be those who are more socially connected, because it's about the quality of relationships that matter. And it's because they have people they can go to for emotional supports. On the other hand, the people who don't have social connections oftentimes died much earlier. They're much more likely to develop cardiovascular problems and have cognitive declines earlier in their life. But wait, you might be asking, there could be so many other factors that go into that. How do you know it's social isolation? To that, I would point you to research that shows that social isolation and loneliness is the equivalent of smoking 15 cigarettes a day. It's the equivalent of being an alcoholic and twice as harmful as having diabetes. For me, when I read those stats, I'm like, this is crazy. How can that be true? The reason why that happens is that at a cellular level, you have cellular decay when you are lonely. Your metabolisms actually start to slow down. If you look at the people of Okinawa, these people are amongst the people who live the longest in our entire world. And what's interesting about the people in Okinawa is that from the moment they are born, they are put together with other people their age. They grow up together and they interact and lean on each other when things get hard. And they live to over an average age of 100 years old. I read a book a few years ago about the top 5 regrets of people on their deathbeds. The author was a nurse who had a lot of interactions with people who are on the last stages of life, and she kind of collected the most common sentiments. Number 4 on that list was people who wish they had stayed more in touch with their friends. Number 3 on that list is people wish they expressed their feelings to the people around them more. But do you know what was number 1 on that list? People wish they came to whisper gatherings. No, I'm just kidding. That wasn't it. Number 1 was people wish they could live the life that they wanted to live rather than living a life expected of them. So you can see from the moment that you were born to the moment that you die, people need community. People are born to connect with one another. We were literally born in our mother's womb in a community. Finally, number 3, that loneliness is permanent. Do you know that 61% of young people face loneliness at one point or another? And I refuse that we can't do anything about that. So I want to share with you what I did in high school and now what I'm doing in college. First, my time at Whisper has challenged me to fundamentally change how I view people. In high school, the kind of conversations that I observed fell into the 3 T's. They were trite, they were about tests, and they were about spilling the tea. The most common interaction I had was limited to 5 words. How are you? I'm good. You learn nothing about a person from those words. It's more of a casual greeting than anything. When I was at Whisper, a lot of the leaders encouraged us to ask more questions that actually sought to know people. The example I remember vividly was asking people what they had for breakfast. But it was weird for me to just go up to someone and be like, hey, what'd you have for breakfast? So instead, I try to ask people, instead of how are you doing, is how have you been? And also when people ask me that question, I want to prepare something more than I'm good. This leads me to my second point, which is that Whisper has taught me to react really vulnerably to people. The problem of loneliness doesn't end at high school. It continues into college. And from my experience, it only gets worse, if anything. But the difference is people in college are better at hiding their emotions. I was grabbing dinner with an old friend the other day, and she was so happy and cheery. Then I asked her about her relationship, and she said, we broke up yesterday, and I haven't been able to stop crying. And I was like, oh my God, we were just laughing 2 minutes ago. How can this be? And what's interesting, at least in the college setting from my experience, is that there's a huge taboo with loneliness. In fact, I've observed people are more likely to acknowledge that they're depressed than to acknowledge that they're lonely. Acknowledging you're lonely is a sign of weakness, and you won't be respected. The first step to breaking down that taboo is controlling our actions. If you take that first step and acknowledge things haven't been that good lately, then oftentimes you'll find that other people are going through the same exact things, but also they're willing to open up more and have a real conversation. The last thing that Whispers taught me is to take a more active stance on building community. I think too often people expect to find community. That community will naturally happen, or you'll be invited to these events. But I think that if you depend on other people for happiness, you will often be disappointed. I want to switch that narrative of instead of finding community, you can build community today. Instead of thinking, I didn't get invited to that event, I think the reverse way of thinking about that is, what can I do to build community today? Who can I invite to have lunch with me? Who are the people who I can bring together? And for me, at college, that's been a driving force of just loving people for who they are instead of loving people to get something out of them. I love talking to my dining hall staff. I try to remember their names. I'm not great with names, but I have a notepad on my phone with all of the people's names. And for me, I think that being friends with people because of compassion is way more effective than being friends with someone because you might want something out of them. The last thing I'll leave you with is, what can I do as an individual? I want to share with you a final story. At the end of World War II, a man by the name of Norman Borlaug made a discovery of GMOs in this factory or in this lab in New Mexico, where he was able to combine different genetics, and he found this high yield corn and wheat that went on to save 2 billion lives across developing countries. For that, he was awarded a Nobel Peace Prize. But my question is, did he deserve that Nobel Peace Prize? Because maybe it should be accredited to another man whose name was Henry Wallace. Henry Wallace was vice president with FDR. Before that, he was the Secretary of Agriculture in the United States. When he was elected as vice president, one of his first big initiatives was setting a lab in New Mexico to study GMOs. For that lab, he hired a man named Norman Borlaug to run it. So maybe it was actually Henry Wallace's contribution, and he should have earned the Nobel Peace Prize. But wait, what if it should be George Washington Carver? Do people know who George Washington Carver is? He's kind of like the peanut guy. When George Washington Carver was in college, he went on weekly expeditions with one of his professor's 6-year-old son. Through those interactions, he instilled in that 6-year-old boy this love for plants and a vision for what they could do for humanity. And do you know who that 6-year-old boy was? He went on to be VP with FDR, and his name was Henry Wallace. So maybe it was George Washington Carver who should deserve that Nobel Peace Prize. The idea and phenomenon behind this is what's known as the butterfly effect. The idea is that this butterfly can flap its wings, which sets air molecules in motion, which sets more air molecules in motion, and eventually that creates this hurricane on the other side of the planet. And the idea is that simple actions from an individual can create long-lasting impacts. 3 things that I wanted to do for myself when I entered college. At my convocation, before I started my freshman year, the dean of my college said this interesting thing. He said, when you start college, you have this unique opportunity to completely redefine your identity. Who you were in high school can be left behind. This is a chance to start anew. So he challenged us to think of who we wanted to be. In high school, I was that kid who wanted to get to know everyone. But in college, I wanted to be someone who could listen with empathy, who could react vulnerably, and who can act intentionally. So today, Whisper has these listen keychains. The reason why it has listen on it is because it's the first step to this chain, to the butterfly effect, to this impact Whisper wants you all to be agents of change. Every time you look at the word listen, I encourage you guys to think back to Norman Borlaug and Henry Wallace and George Washington Carver, and that the day-to-day interactions you have with people could make a lasting impact, even if it means just one person that you help today. That's more than enough. Thank you for having me.